10 years ago, I believed loyalty was worth more than any contract. Back then, my name was Ryan Mitchell. I was 34 years old, living in Phoenix, Arizona, and running a construction company I had spent an entire decade building from the ground up. I hadn't done it alone. My best friend, Eric Collins, had been there from the beginning. We met in community college, worked our first construction jobs together, and eventually decided we were tired of making other people rich. We pooled everything we had, our savings, an old pickup truck, and more determination than experience, and started Mitchell & Collins Construction. The first few years were brutal. Some months we barely had enough money to cover payroll. Eric handled the financial side, while I managed projects and clients. It worked because we trusted each other completely. At least I thought we did. 10 years later, people around Phoenix knew our name. We weren't the biggest company in Arizona, but we had earned a reputation for delivering projects on time and never cutting corners. Most of our business came from referrals, something I was proud of because it couldn't be bought. One Friday afternoon, everything seemed to be falling perfectly into place. Our conference room was packed. Eric walked in carrying a bottle of champagne, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "We got it," he announced. Everyone looked at him. The Desert Ridge Development Project. For a second, nobody reacted. Then the room exploded. It was the biggest contract our company had ever won, worth nearly $20 million over 3 years. People were hugging each other. Someone turned on music. Our project managers were already talking about hiring new crews. Eric wrapped an arm around my shoulder. "I told you we'd make it someday." I laughed. "We're just getting started." That night, we celebrated at our favorite steakhouse. Our employees filled 2 long tables. Glasses clinked. People made speeches. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to relax. I even started thinking about buying a house instead of renting one. Maybe taking an actual vacation. Maybe slowing down just a little. Looking back now, I realize success has a strange way of making you ignore warning signs. Eric kept stepping away from the table to answer phone calls. When I asked who kept calling, he smiled. "Bank stuff. Nothing exciting." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He had been my best friend for over 15 years. 3 days later, everything collapsed. Monday morning started like every other. I grabbed coffee on the way to the office. The Arizona sun was already heating the sidewalks before 8. When I pulled into our parking lot, something felt wrong. The front doors were locked. 2 sheriff's deputies stood near the entrance. Our receptionist was crying. Several employees were gathered outside, staring at the building. I walked toward the doors. One of the deputies stepped in front of me. "Can I help you, sir? I own this company." He looked down at a folder in his hands. "I'm sorry. This property is being secured under a court order." I frowned. "There has to be some mistake. I suggest you contact your attorney." Before I could say another word, my phone started vibrating. It was our bank. The woman on the line sounded uncomfortable. "Mr. Mitchell, your business accounts have been frozen." "What are you talking about?" "There have been ownership changes filed over the weekend." My stomach tightened. "What ownership changes?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss that over the phone." She hung up. I called Eric immediately. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Nothing. Then I called our accountant. Disconnected. Within the next hour, pieces of the truth began falling into place. Eric was gone. So was our chief accountant. Nearly every financial record had disappeared. By lunchtime, my attorney arrived with news that barely seemed possible. "Ryan," he looked at me with genuine sympathy. "Someone spent months preparing this." He placed several documents on the hood of my truck. Every signature looked authentic. Every filing had been approved. Every transfer had been processed. Legally, I no longer owned the company I had spent 10 years building. I stared at the building bearing our name. Employees carried cardboard boxes to their cars. Someone lowered our company sign from the front entrance. The wind caught the banner as it fell to the ground. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to lose everything in a single morning. The days that followed felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. At first, I believed there had to be a mistake. Surely a judge would see what had happened. Surely the police would realize I'd been robbed. Instead, every conversation ended the same way. "Mr. Mitchell, everything appears to have been signed legally." Legally. I grew to hate that word. My attorney spent weeks digging through contracts, bank transfers, and corporate filings. Every new document made the situation worse. Eric hadn't betrayed me overnight. He had been planning it for months. He had quietly created shell companies, moved assets through complicated transactions, and convinced our accountant to help him. Every signature matched mine because he had access to years of company records. By the time I realized what had happened, there was almost nothing left to recover. Then came the lawsuits. Suppliers demanded payment. Subcontractors blamed me for canceled projects. Clients wanted their deposits returned. To the outside world, I wasn't the victim. I was simply the owner whose company had collapsed. News spread quickly through Phoenix's business community. Some people avoided my calls. Others returned them only to say they couldn't risk working with me anymore. My reputation disappeared almost as fast as my business. One afternoon, I walked into a coffee shop and overheard two former employees talking. I heard Ryan spent all the company's money. No, I heard he was gambling. I always knew something was off. Neither of them noticed I was standing only a few feet away. I turned around before they could. It was easier than trying to explain the truth. The hardest conversation came a week later. Megan sat across from me in our apartment, quietly stirring a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She hadn't said much since everything happened. Neither had I. Finally, she looked up. "I can't keep living like this, Ryan." I already knew what was coming. "This isn't forever," I said. "I'm fighting it." She nodded slowly. "I know, but I don't think you're going to win." The words hit harder than I expected. She reached across the table and took my hand. "I love the man you were before all this." Before all this. As if that version of me no longer existed. But every day, you wake up angry. Every conversation is about Eric, the lawsuits, or the company. You're disappearing. I wanted to argue. Instead, I realized she was right. I hadn't smiled in weeks. I barely slept. Every morning started with phone calls from lawyers. Every night ended with another bill I couldn't pay. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I can't do this anymore." She packed her things that same weekend. The apartment felt twice as empty after she left. Within 2 months, I had sold nearly everything I owned. My truck, most of my furniture, even the watch my father had given me after my first successful project. The hardest part was selling the house I had only recently bought. The real estate agent called it a financial adjustment. To me, it felt like another funeral. Eventually, I took the only job I could find. Assistant site supervisor for a small commercial construction crew. No one there knew I had once owned a company. To them, I was simply Ryan, the quiet guy who arrived before sunrise and stayed long after everyone else had gone home. I never complained. I measured walls, checked blueprints, solved problems, worked 12-hour shifts without taking breaks. One afternoon, an older man wearing worn-out work boots stood beside me while I inspected a damaged foundation. "You've done this before," he said. I looked up. "I've been around construction most of my life." He smiled. "No." He pointed toward the plans in my hands. "You think like someone who built companies, not just buildings." I laughed for the first time in months. "I used to." The man extended his hand. "My name's Walter Brooks." I shook it. "Ryan Mitchell." His expression changed for just a second. "I've heard that name before." I expected pity or suspicion. Instead, Walter simply nodded. "Come by my office tomorrow morning." I frowned. "For what?" He smiled. "I think your story isn't over yet." The next morning, I almost didn't go. After everything that had happened, I had learned not to expect good news from anyone in a suit or behind a desk. Hope had become something I no longer trusted. Still, at 8 o'clock sharp, I knocked on the door of Walter Brooks' office. It wasn't the kind of office I was used to. No glass walls. No expensive furniture. No receptionist. Just a modest building behind one of his construction yards, a faded company logo on the wall, and decades of photographs showing completed projects. Walter motioned for me to sit. "I looked in your story last night," he said. I sighed. "So you've probably decided I'm not worth the risk." He shook his head. "I think you trusted the wrong man." That was the first time anyone had said those words instead of blaming me. Walter leaned back in his chair. "I've been in construction for over 40 years. I've seen partners steal from each other, brothers sue each other, and families destroy businesses over greed. He smiled faintly. But I also know talent when I see it. He slid a folder across the desk. I need someone to manage one of my divisions. I looked down at the paperwork. The salary wasn't impressive. The title wasn't glamorous. But it was a chance. I'll take it, I said without hesitation. Walter laughed. You didn't even finish reading? I don't need to. For the next 5 years, my life revolved around one thing. Work. I was usually the first person to arrive and the last to leave. While everyone else went home, I stayed to review budgets, negotiate with suppliers, and solve problems before they became disasters. Walter noticed everything. One evening, after another 14-hour day, he walked into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee. You remind me of myself, he said. I hope that's a compliment. It is. He looked around at the blueprints covering my desk. But there's one difference. What's that? When I was your age, I was trying to become successful. He pointed at me. You're trying to prove something. I didn't answer, because he was right. Every promotion, every completed project, every new client. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I imagined Eric hearing about it. I imagined him realizing I hadn't disappeared. Walter eventually promoted me to operations director, then vice president. Within a few years, Brooks Construction had doubled its annual revenue. We expanded into neighboring states. Won contracts we never could have imagined before. People in the industry started talking about our company again. Only this time, they mentioned my name with respect instead of sympathy. Then, one Friday afternoon, Walter called me into his office. He looked older than usual. Retirement had been on his mind for months. I've made a decision, he said. I'm selling the company. I smiled politely. Congratulations. He shook his head. I'm not selling it to a corporation. I frowned. I'm selling it to you. I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. Me? My children don't want this business. He looked around his office. You do. I couldn't speak. I've watched you rebuild your life from nothing, Walter continued. I've watched you treat every employee with respect, every client with honesty, and every problem like it was your own. He smiled. I built this company. Then he pointed toward me. You earned it. 6 months later, the deal was complete. For the second time in my life, I owned a construction company. But this time it was different. I trusted contracts more than promises. I trusted actions more than words. And I never forgot what betrayal looked like. A few weeks after taking over, my CFO walked into my office holding a financial report. You might find this interesting. He placed it on my desk. At the top of the page was a company name I hadn't seen in years. Collins Development Group. Eric's business. It had become one of the fastest-growing construction firms in the Southwest. But as I continued reading, one detail caught my attention. Almost all of its expansion had been financed through massive loans. The company looked successful, but underneath, it was carrying more debt than I had ever imagined. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time in nearly a decade, I realized fate had just given me something I never expected, an opportunity. I stared at the financial report for nearly an hour. On the surface, Collins Development Group looked unstoppable. New office, luxury headquarters, multi-million-dollar projects, industry awards, business magazine covers. If someone had looked only at the headlines, they would have believed Eric Collins had become one of the smartest entrepreneurs in Arizona. But numbers tell stories that headlines never do. And these numbers were screaming. The company wasn't growing because it was profitable. It was growing because it kept borrowing. Every new project depended on another loan. Every expansion relied on another line of credit. One missed payment could bring the entire structure crashing down. I closed the report and looked out the window. For years, I had imagined confronting Eric, telling him exactly what he'd done to me, asking him why. But now none of that mattered. The truth was simple. He had built an empire on borrowed money. And borrowed money always has a due date. A week later, I called my legal team. I want to know who owns his debt. My attorney raised an eyebrow. Planning a hostile acquisition? I smiled faintly. I'm planning to protect an investment. That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. Over the next 8 months, we worked quietly. We never approached Eric directly. Instead, we created an investment group that purchased pieces of his outstanding loans whenever banks were willing to sell them. 1 loan became 3. 3 became 7. Eventually, We controlled enough of the debt that every major financial decision inside Collins Development Group depended on us. Eric never knew. To him, we were just another institutional investor. Business continued as usual. Then luck stepped in. Eric announced the biggest project of his career, a luxury waterfront development worth nearly $200 million. Every local newspaper covered the story. Television cameras followed him as he shook hands with city officials. I watched the press conference from my office. He looked exactly the same. Confident, charming, completely certain he had already won. My CFO walked in as the broadcast ended. "Everything is ready." I nodded. "Then let's begin." 3 days before construction was scheduled to start, our investment group exercised its legal rights. Because of several financial covenant violations buried deep inside the loan agreements, we demanded immediate repayment. Perfectly legal, perfectly enforceable. The banks followed. Within 48 hours, Eric's lenders froze additional funding. Suppliers stopped delivering materials. Insurance companies requested updated guarantees. Subcontractors began pulling out of the project. The house of cards started collapsing exactly the way the numbers had predicted. My phone never rang. Eric still had no idea who was behind it. Until Friday afternoon. My assistant entered my office. "There's someone here asking for the chairman." "Who is it?" She hesitated. "Eric Collins." I looked at the clock. 10 years. Almost to the day. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the conference room. Through the glass wall, I could see him. He looked older, more tired. The confidence was still there, but it was cracking. He stood as I opened the door. For a second, he didn't recognize me. Then his eyes widened. His face lost all color. "Ryan." It was the first time he had said my name in a decade. I smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Eric." He stared at me, trying to understand. "You?" His voice almost disappeared. "You're the investor?" I slowly closed the conference room door behind me. "Please." I gestured toward the chair across the table. "Have a seat." For the first time in 10 years, the man who had taken everything from me was the one asking for help. Eric lowered himself into the chair without taking his eyes off me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. 10 years. 10 years of questions, anger, and sleepless nights had led to this room. Ironically, I no longer felt angry. I simply felt calm. Eric broke the silence first. "I had no idea it was you." "I know," I replied. He looked around the conference room before letting out a nervous laugh. "I've heard about Brooks Construction's growth, but I never connected the dots. You weren't supposed to." He leaned forward. "Ryan, before we talk business, I need you to understand something." I didn't answer. "What happened back then?" He paused, searching for the right words. "It wasn't personal." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was exactly what I expected him to say. "You stole a company we built together. I did what I had to do. You destroyed 10 years of my life." He looked down at the table. "I was offered investors who wanted complete control. They believed you were too cautious. They gave me a choice. And you chose money." He didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed. "I kept telling myself you'd recover. You're talented. I figured you'd land on your feet." I nodded slowly. "You know what I remember?" He looked up. I remember standing outside our office while deputies locked the doors. I folded my hands on the table. I remember selling my truck, my house, even my father's watch just to pay legal bills. His face tightened. I remember people whispering that I was a fraud. The room fell silent again. Finally, Eric spoke. "I'm sorry." They were words I had imagined hearing for years. Yet they meant almost nothing. "I'm sure you are," I said quietly. He swallowed. "What do you want?" There it was. The only question that mattered. I slid a folder across the table. He opened it. His eyes moved from one page to the next. Then they stopped. "No." His voice barely escaped. "You own the debt. Most of it." He looked up in disbelief. "This means... It means your company can't survive without my approval." He closed the folder and leaned back. For the first time since I'd known him, Eric Collins looked defeated. After a long silence, he asked the question I never thought I'd hear. "Will you help me?" I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. 10 years earlier, I had stood outside a locked office wondering how my life could possibly get worse. Now the man responsible for that moment was asking me to save his future. I turned back toward him. I will. Hope returned his face. Then I finished the sentence. I'll help your employees. His expression froze. I'll make sure every project is completed. I'll keep every worker who wants to stay. I'll honor every client contract. He frowned. And me? I met his eyes. You made sure I lost everything except my ability to start over. I paused. I'm giving you the same opportunity. He understood immediately. There would be no position, no partnership, no second chance. Only the chance to rebuild his life from nothing, exactly as I had. He slowly stood. I deserve that. I didn't answer. As he reached the door, he stopped. I really am sorry, Ryan. This time I believed him. But forgiveness and consequences are not the same thing. After he left, my CFO entered the room. So, he smiled. How do you feel? I looked once more at the skyline. For years, I had believed revenge would be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it felt like closing a chapter one should have finished long ago. I don't feel like I won, I said. What do you feel like? I smiled for the first time that day. Free. A month later, Collins Development Group officially became part of Brooks Construction. Nearly every employee kept their job. Every project was completed. The only person who truly lost everything was the man who had once believed loyalty had a price. As for me, I finally understood something that had taken 10 years to learn. Eric didn't steal my future. He only stole my past. Everything that came after, I built with my own hands.